The supermarket doors hissed open as she staggered toward the curb, her hand clawing at her stomach as if she could hold her life together by force. Before she hit the asphalt, the nurse caught her phone. The emergency contact didn't say husband or councilman. It simply said, Dante. Always. Within 12 minutes, the city's most feared crime lord breached the hospital's security, for shadows flanking him and an expression that made the guards forget how to breathe. The humidity over the city that Tuesday was a heavy, suffocating weight. Fluorescent lights flickered with a rhythmic, clinical hum inside Mercy General's waiting room. It was a stagnant afternoon until 3:14 p.m. The automatic doors slid back, admitting a rush of heat and a woman who looked like she was being erased from the inside out. Nora Sullivan was pale, her damp hair clinging to a face mapped with silent agony. Her expensive cardigan was twisted, her movements jerky and uncoordinated. She wasn't just falling, she was retreating into herself. She leaned heavily against the triage station, her fingers white-knuckled as she gripped her pregnant belly. Please, she choked out, her voice a fractured thread. The baby. The asphalt of the grocery store parking lot was still warm, radiating a dry heat that made the air wobble. Nora didn't fall all at once. It was a slow, stuttering surrender of her muscles. She felt the rough grit of the pavement against her palms first, then the jarring weight of her hip hitting the ground. She stayed there, curled around her stomach, watching a discarded receipt tumble past her eyes in the breeze. No one moved for a long heartbeat. To the shoppers passing by, she was just a woman who had tripped, but Nora could feel the strange, cold hollow opening up inside her chest. By the time the ambulance doors hissed shut, the world had shrunk to the size of a flickering fluorescent light above her stretcher. At Mercy General, the triage room smelled of industrial lemon and old adrenaline. Sarah Jenkins, the intake nurse, moved with a quiet, practiced speed. She checked Nora's pulse, then her pupils, noting the way the younger woman's gaze drifted toward the ceiling, unfocused and distant. Nora wasn't fighting the pain. She was drifting away from it. I need to call someone, Nora, Sarah said softly, reaching for the smartphone tucked into the pocket of the damp cardigan. Your husband? Nora didn't answer. She only tightened her grip on the thin hospital blanket. Sarah found the contact labeled read. She pressed call. It rang 6 times, a lonely, mechanical sound in the small room, before a generic recording asked her to leave a message. Sarah waited 30 seconds and tried again. The result was the same. She looked back at Nora, but the woman had closed her eyes, her breathing shallow and ragged. A councilman's wife shouldn't be this alone in a crisis, yet the silence from the phone felt heavy and deliberate. Sarah scrolled further down the list, past the doctors and the political aides, until she hit the bottom of the directory. There was no name, only a string of numbers. In the notes field, for words stood out against the white screen, Dante. Always. Call Dante. It looked like a warning, or a lifeline. Sarah tapped the number. It didn't even finish the first ring. Where is she? The voice was a low, gravelly vibration that seemed to bypass the phone's speaker entirely. It wasn't the voice of a worried relative. It was the voice of a man who had been sitting in the dark, waiting for the world to break. She's at Mercy General, Sarah whispered, her own heart suddenly jumping. Triage room 4. She collapsed, and I can't reach. I'm coming, the man interrupted. The line went dead. Sarah set the phone down on the metal tray. She looked at the monitor tracking Nora's vitals. The heart rate was steady, but the oxygen levels were dipping. As she adjusted the mask, Sarah noticed a small, purple bruise on the inside of Nora's wrist. Not from a fall, but a perfectly circular mark, like someone had held her there just a little too long. The quiet Tuesday was over. The air in the hallway was already starting to change. The hospital's automatic doors didn't just open, they seemed to retreat. Exactly 12 minutes after the call ended, 5 men crossed the threshold. They didn't run or shout. They moved with a synchronized, heavy pace that forced the crowded lobby to part like water before a prow. 4 of them fanned out, their backs to the walls, eyes scanning the room with the bored intensity of predators. Dante Moretti walked straight to the reception desk. He was taller than he looked on the news, his dark suit tailored so perfectly it looked like armor. He didn't lean on the counter. He stood perfectly still, his hands relaxed at his sides. "Nora Sullivan," he said. His voice was quiet, but it carried to every corner of the room. "Triage 4. The receptionist started to ask for his ID, her mouth opening to recite hospital policy. Dante didn't interrupt her. He simply looked at her, a steady, unblinking gaze that held no anger, only a terrifying certainty. The woman's voice died in her throat. She didn't look at her computer screen. She simply pointed toward the restricted hallway. Dante nodded once and walked past the security desk. The guard there didn't move a finger to stop him. Inside the surgical waiting area, the air grew thick and heavy. Dante chose a plastic chair in the corner, far from the television mounting on the wall. He didn't pace. He didn't check his watch. He sat with his spine straight, his large frame making the furniture look fragile and absurd. Sarah Jenkins watched him from the nurse's station. To the city, this man was a ghost story told to keep people in line, a shadow behind every illegal scent moving through the docks. But here, in the dim light of the ward, she saw something else. Dante wasn't looking at the doors. He was staring at a small, discarded hair tie on the floor, his jaw tight enough to crack bone. One of his men approached and leaned down, whispering something about the councilman's office. Dante didn't turn his head. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a second phone, one that looked encrypted and battered, and slid it across the small table toward his associate. "Trace the vitamins," Dante said softly. The man paused, his eyebrows furrowing. "The ones she takes every morning?" "All of them," Dante replied. "And check the seal on the bottle she kept in her purse. If it's been tampered with, I want the name of the chemist." The associate nodded and vanished back into the shadows of the hallway. Dante returned to his stillness, his eyes fixing once more on the ticking clock. For the first time, Sarah realized he wasn't just waiting for a medical update. He was waiting for a war to begin. He looked less like a boss and more like a man who had already counted the cost of what he was about to do. The fluorescent lights of the hospital waiting room faded, replaced by the damp, concrete chill of a parking garage 18 months earlier. Nora had been standing outside the community legal aid office, her fingers trembling as she tucked a folder of divorce papers into her bag. She was there under the guise of a charity luncheon, her heart racing every time a car door slammed. In this part of the city, she was invisible, not the polished wife of Councilman Reed Sullivan, but just another woman looking for a way out. Dante Moretti had been leaning against a black sedan 10 feet away, finishing a conversation with a lawyer. He hadn't been looking for her, but when the office door opened and Nora stepped out, the air seemed to shift. A shadow moved behind a frosted glass window nearby. Nora didn't just turn, she flinched, her entire body jerking back as she pulled her coat tight around her throat. It was a small, reflexive movement, the kind made by someone who spent their life measuring the distance to the nearest exit. Dante saw it. He didn't move toward her, and he didn't offer a smile. He simply watched her with a heavy, knowing stillness. "The paperwork won't protect you from a man like Reed Sullivan," Dante said. His voice was low, cutting through the silence of the garage. Nora froze. She hadn't mentioned her husband's name to anyone inside. She looked at Dante, the tattoos peeking from his collar, the cold intelligence in his eyes, and realized he didn't see a politician's wife. He saw a captive. "I don't know who you are," Nora whispered, her voice shaking. "I'm the person he's afraid of," Dante replied simply. He took a single step forward, stopping well outside her personal space. "You're looking for a legal solution to a person who doesn't follow the law. That's a dangerous mistake." Nora looked down at her hands. She noticed he wasn't trying to charm her or rescue her. He was speaking to her like a soldier assessing a wound. "Why do you care?" she asked. "I recognize the look," he said, nodding toward her stiff shoulders. "I grew up around men who use silence as a weapon. It's a hard way to breathe." He didn't hand her a business card or ask for her number. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a plain, silver key. He set it on the hood of his car and walked away without looking back. "That goes to a quiet apartment on 4th Street," he called out over his shoulder. The lease is in a name that doesn't exist. If you ever need to disappear for a night, the door is already unlocked. Nora watched him drive away. She didn't take the key that day, but she didn't throw it away either. She realized then that Dante wasn't a hero, and he wasn't a husband. He was something she had never had before, a witness who didn't expect her to smile through the pain. The swinging doors of the surgical wing remained closed, but the world outside them was moving with a cold, terrifying speed. While Nora lay under the bright lights of the operating room, Dante's people were already dismantling her life, piece by piece. One of Dante's men, a man named Marco who moved like a shadow, approached him in the quiet corridor. He held a tablet displaying a lab report. The hospital's standard blood work had flagged an anomaly, but Dante's private specialists had found the truth. It wasn't a sudden illness. It was a build-up. "It's a rare compound," Marco whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the hospital's ventilation. "Added to her daily prenatal vitamins. It's tasteless, odorless, and designed to look like a natural pregnancy complication if given in small doses over time." Dante didn't move. He didn't even blink. He simply looked at the digital trail Marco scrolled through. The purchase order for the chemical hadn't come from Reed Sullivan's office. It had been handled by his personal assistant, a woman who had worked for the councilman for a decade. The timeline was precise, 21 days of slow, methodical administration. "There's more," Marco continued, his finger tapping the screen. "The assistant didn't act alone. We tracked a burner phone used to coordinate the drop-off. The signals lead back to a warehouse in the shipping district. It's a Soriano property." The mention of the Soriano crew, Dante's oldest rivals, caused the air in the hallway to grow thin. This wasn't just a husband trying to hide a mistake. This was a political alliance. Reed Sullivan hadn't lashed out in a moment of anger. He had sat down at his mahogany desk and scheduled his wife's end like a campaign meeting. He had traded her life to the very people Dante had spent years keeping out of the city. Dante reached out and took the tablet. The last bit of warmth vanished from his expression, leaving his face as hard and blank as a marble statue. He wasn't looking at a lab report anymore. He was looking at a declaration of war. He handed the tablet back and looked toward the elevators where his other men stood waiting. "The assistant," Dante said, his voice flat and final. "Bring her to the warehouse. Not the Sorianos. Ours." "And the councilman?" Marco asked. Dante looked at the closed doors of the surgery wing, where the woman who had once flinched at a shadow was now fighting for 2 lives. "Don't touch him yet," Dante replied. "A man like Reed Sullivan loves his reputation. I want him to watch it burn before he realizes he's already dead." The orders were given with a single, sharp nod. As his men moved toward the exit, Dante turned back to the surgical doors, his hand resting briefly on the cold metal. He had made a decision. He would no longer be a witness. He would be the reckoning. Dante did not leave the hospital. He didn't need to. Power, in its purest form, was the ability to move the world while sitting perfectly still in a plastic waiting room chair. While the surgeons worked to save Nora, Dante's team of analysts worked to destroy Reed Sullivan. Dante didn't send men with guns to the councilman's manor. Instead, he sent a series of digital files. There were folders of financial forensics showing offshore accounts, encrypted communications detailing the poison's delivery, and a paper trail that linked Reed directly to the Soriano crew. It was a masterpiece of destruction. Dante didn't just leak the information to a tabloid. He delivered it simultaneously to a federal grand jury and an investigative journalist famous for taking down giants. By 2 a.m., the evidence was already being printed and filed. There would be no bribes large enough to stop this, and no political favors deep enough to bury it. While the legal world prepared for Reed's downfall, the underworld dealt with the Sorianos. Dante's orders were surgical. He didn't want a street war, he wanted a removal. One by one, the Soriano warehouses went dark. Their burner phones went silent. By the time the sun began to peek over the city's skyline, the organization that had helped poison Nora simply ceased to exist. Dante sat in the hallway as the first morning light hit the linoleum floor. His phone buzzed once. It was a short video clip from a news van parked outside Reed's house. The councilman was being let out in handcuffs, his expensive silk shirt wrinkled, his face a mask of panicked confusion. He looked small. He looked like a man who had finally realized that his power was an illusion compared to the man he had crossed. Dante watched the clip once and deleted it. He didn't feel a rush of victory. He only felt the heavy, quiet satisfaction of a job finished. By dawn, two separate empires had been erased. One had been dismantled by the law, and the other by the dark. Both paths led back to the same quiet corridor at Mercy General, yet not a single fingerprint of Dante Moretti could be found on the wreckage. He had burned Reed Sullivan's world to the ground without ever raising his voice or leaving Nora's side. A nurse stepped out of the surgical wing, pulling off her mask. She looked tired, but she caught Dante's eye and gave a small, weary nod. Dante finally closed his eyes and let out a long, slow breath. The war was over. Now, he had to see if there was anything left of the peace. The first thing Nora felt was the rhythmic, metallic thumping of a heart. For a terrified second, she thought it was her own, struggling to keep up. Then she realized the sound was coming from the monitor beside her bed. It was too fast, too bright, a tiny, galloping beat that filled the quiet room. Arya. Nora shifted her head on the pillow. The hospital room was bathed in the soft, gray light of early morning. Sitting in the chair by the window, his silhouette sharp against the glass, was Dante. He wasn't on his phone. He wasn't reading. He was simply watching her, his hands resting motionless on his knees. He didn't move toward her until she blinked, her eyes finally holding his. "She's fine, Nora," Dante said. His voice was a low anchor in the sterile room. "The doctors managed to stabilize everything. The heartbeat is strong." Nora let out a breath she felt she had been holding for years. Her hand moved instinctively toward her stomach, feeling the slow rise and fall of her own breathing. Then she looked at the television mounted on the wall. It was muted, but the scrolling text at the bottom told the story. There was Reed's face, captured in a blurry, mid-action shot outside his campaign headquarters. Police officers were guiding him into the back of a black car. Dante followed her gaze. "He was arrested at 6 a.m., he said quietly. "The evidence was overwhelming. He won't be coming back." Nora looked at the screen, then back at Dante. She saw the dark circles under his eyes and the way he held himself, like a man who had walked through fire and hadn't yet felt the burn. She understood then that the world had changed while she was asleep. Dante hadn't just saved her, he had dismantled her life to keep her safe. He had exposed secrets that he usually kept hidden in the shadows, crossing lines that a man in his position never crossed. He had acted without her permission. He had made a choice for her because there hadn't been time for a conversation. Dante stood up, moving to the side of the bed. He reached out as if to check her foreline, but his hand stopped an inch away, giving her the space to pull back. He looked like he was waiting for her to tell him he had gone too far. Nora didn't pull away. Instead, she reached out and rested her fingers on his sleeve. The fabric was expensive, but beneath it, she felt the rigid tension of his arm. "The safe house key," she whispered, her voice cracking from the anesthesia. "I still have it." Dante's expression didn't change, but his eyes softened, just a fraction. "You won't need a hidden apartment anymore, Nora. The city knows what he is now." "I know," she said. She looked at the monitor again, listening to the steady gallop of their daughter's heart. Then she looked up at the man who had traded his silence for her life. "Stay, please." Dante didn't answer with words. He simply sat back down, pulling the chair closer to the bed, and settled into the stillness. For the first time in 18 months, Nora didn't flinch at the shadows. She closed her eyes and let the sound of the monitor lead her back to sleep. 13 months later, the air didn't smell of hospital lemon or parking lot exhaust. It smelled of expensive ink and the faint, sweet scent of baby powder. Sunlight cut across the polished oak of a conference table at Moretti Holdings, illuminating a set of quarterly reports. Nora sat at the head of the table. She wasn't wearing a damp cardigan anymore. She wore a tailored suit that didn't hide her presence, but announced it. In the corner of the office, near a floor-to-ceiling window, a bassinet stood in the warmth. Arya was asleep, her small hand curled into a tiny fist, oblivious to the millions of dollars being moved in the room around her. Nora turned a page in the report. She wasn't looking at campaign numbers or legal aid forms. She was overseeing the development and foundation arms of Dante's empire, the legitimate side of the business that acted as its public face. She spoke the language of boardrooms and city planners, a world Reed Sullivan had once thought he owned. The Southside project is over budget by 4%, Nora said. Her voice was calm, but the room went quiet. The materials were diverted to a site we don't own. I want to know who signed off on the shipping manifests. Across the table, two men in dark suits shifted in their seats. They were veterans of the Moretti organization, men who had spent decades in back alleys and warehouses. They looked at the bassinet, then at each other. Their silence wasn't respectful, it was heavy with a quiet, simmering resentment. To them, Nora was a reminder that the old ways were changing. They saw her authority as a sign that Dante had grown soft, trading his edge for a family life and a legitimate corporation. One of the men, Marco Vitali, leaned forward. He didn't look at Nora. He looked at the closed door of Dante's private office. "It's a minor discrepancy, Nora," Marco said, his voice trailing with a sharp, hidden edge. "In the old days, we didn't worry about 4%. We worried about results." Nora didn't flinch. She didn't look at the door for help, either. She slowly closed the folder and rested her hands on the table. She noticed the way Marco's eyes kept darting to the bassinet, as if the child's presence was an insult to the business they did. "In the old days, 4% was the cost of doing business," Nora replied, her gaze steady on his. "Now it's a trail. And I don't like trails I didn't authorize." She saw a flicker of something in Marco's eyes, not fear, but a cold, new calculation. He wasn't just annoyed by her questions anymore. He was testing her. "I'll look into it," Marco muttered, standing up without waiting to be dismissed. As the men filed out, Nora didn't return to the reports. She looked at the bassinet, then at the list of names on the shipping manifest. She noticed a name she hadn't seen in months, a supplier linked to a ghost corporation. The piece they had built wasn't a gift. It was a wall, and for the first time, Nora could see the cracks forming from the inside. She reached out and touched the gold pen on her desk, her jaw tightening. She wasn't just surviving the dark anymore. She was starting to see how it moved. The office was silent, save for the rhythmic scratching of Nora's pen against a legal pad. On her screen, a spreadsheet glowed with rows of numbers that didn't quite settle. The discrepancy was tiny, less than 0.5% in the foundation's concrete pouring costs. Most auditors would have called it rounding. Most people would have ignored it. Nora didn't. She remembered how Reed used to hide his tracks in the margins of boring reports. She knew that the biggest lies always lived in the smallest details. Over the next 4 days, Nora didn't mention the numbers to Dante. She didn't talk to the accountants. Instead, she stayed late, tracing the electronic thread from the foundation's payroll to a shell company registered in Delaware. From there, the money moved like a ghost, flowing into warehouse leases in the mid-Atlantic. When she pulled the shipping manifests for those warehouses, her blood went cold. The names on the delivery signatures weren't new. They were remnants of the Soriano crew, men who should have been gone, men who had helped poison her. Then she found the final piece, the authorization signature for the foundation's extra costs. It was a digital stamp belonging to Marco Vitali. Marco wasn't just skimming money for a vacation. He was using the Moretti's own legitimate funds to breathe life back into their enemies. He was funding a resurrection under their own roof. Nora closed her laptop. She didn't feel the panic she used to feel when she discovered a secret. She felt a sharp, cold clarity. She printed the files, every manifest, every wire transfer, every signature, and placed them in a plain manila folder. She didn't call security. She didn't alert Dante's guards. She picked up the desk phone and dialed Marco's internal extension. "Marco," she said, her voice as smooth as glass. "I'm looking at the final Southside audit. I have a few questions about the logistics. Come to my office. Now." She didn't wait for his response before hanging up. 10 minutes later, the heavy oak door creaked open. Marco Vitali walked in, his expression relaxed, his hands tucked into his pockets. He still had that look of quiet contempt, the one that said he was only here because he was humoring the boss's wife. He sat in the chair across from her, leaning back as if he owned the air in the room. "You're working late, Nora," he said, his tone bordering on a patronizing smile. "Dante's going to think I'm working you too hard." Nora didn't smile back. She didn't even look up from the folder on her desk. She simply slid the first page across the polished wood, a wire transfer to the Delaware Shell Company. "I'm not working for Dante right now, Marco," she said quietly. "I'm working for the foundation, and I'd like you to tell me why our charitable funds are paying for warehouse space in Virginia." The smile on Marco's face didn't vanish, it froze. The room suddenly felt very small, and for the first time, the man across from her wasn't looking at a politician's wife. He was looking at a hunter. Marco didn't look at the papers at first. He kept his eyes on Nora, his posture relaxed, leaning one elbow on her desk. "You've spent too much time looking at spreadsheets, Nora," he said, his voice dropping into a low, mocking tone. "This isn't the life for you. You should be in the other room with the baby, leaving the heavy lifting to the men who built this place." Nora didn't blink. She didn't argue. She simply slid the entire manila folder toward him. It landed with a heavy thud between his hands. "The heavy lifting is done, Marco," she said. Her voice was quiet, almost a whisper. "I've already mapped the bank accounts. I've talked to the warehouse manager in Virginia. He was surprisingly talkative once he realized I knew about the Soriano connection." Marco's eyes flicked down. He opened the folder, his thumb tracing the edge of a photo showing him meeting a known Soriano associate. The color drained from his face, replaced by a sudden, sharp desperation. He lunged forward, slamming his palm onto the desk. "You think you can take me down with a few photocopies?" he hissed, his face inches from hers. "I was with Dante when he was nothing. He won't kill his most loyal lieutenant because his wife got bored and started playing detective." Nora didn't flinch. She didn't even move back. She just looked at him, her gaze empty of the fear that used to define her. "I'm not asking him to kill you, Marco. I'm telling you that you've already been replaced. The accounts are frozen. Your men have been reassigned. You aren't a lieutenant anymore. You're a liability." The heavy office door clicked shut. Dante was standing in the doorway. He didn't have his jacket on, and his sleeves were rolled up. He didn't rush to the desk. He didn't pull a weapon. He simply leaned against the frame, his eyes moving from the folder to Marco, then finally to Nora. He saw the evidence. He saw the strength in her shoulders. He understood in a single second that she hadn't called him because she needed protection. She had called him because she was finished. Marco turned, his mouth opening to explain, to plead, to lie. Dante didn't look at him. He kept his eyes on Nora. "What is the verdict?" Dante asked. The question was a gift of absolute authority. Nora looked at Marco. She saw the man who had looked at her with contempt for a year. She saw a remnant of the world that tried to erase her. "Take everything he has," Nora said. "Strip his name from the holdings. Send him to the docks. He can start over at the bottom, or he can leave the city tonight. If I see him on a manifest again, he won't get a second conversation." Dante nodded once. Two men appeared behind him in the hall, and without a word, they led a trembling Marco away. The room grew still. Dante crossed the floorboards creaking under his weight. He stopped behind Nora's chair and rested a heavy, warm hand on her shoulder. He didn't say thank you, or well done. He didn't need to. The weight of his hand said everything. From the adjoining room, a small, bright coo echoed through the quiet office. Arya was awake. They both turned toward the sound at the same time. The Empire was no longer a shadow they hid in. It was a fortress they had built together. And the woman who had once collapsed in a parking lot, invisible and broken, was now the one who decided who stayed and who went in a city that finally answered to her name.